Welcome to the Operation Weserübung, your preemptive invasion of Norway. Intelligence has informed us the Allies intend to occupy Norway, so High Command has decided we must strike first. It is believed that if we are able to secure enough vital ports in Norway, we will deny our enemies its strategic bases and vital resources. You must seize the major ports along the Norwegian coast. Ensure a decisive victory by securing the northernmost port of Namsos. Expect minimal ground resistance from the Norwegians, but heavy naval support from the British. To assist you in your campaign, the Kriegsmarine has generously supplied several cruisers, destroyers and U-boats to serve as auxiliary forces. As always, time is of the essence. You should strive to achieve your objectives before you become bogged down in an extended battle against an entrenched enemy that will receive increasing aid from Britain and France.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're going to be playing Panzer Corps once again. I've been doing a little bit of a series on YouTube late at night where I've been streaming Panzer Corps as I play through the campaign game of the original Panzer Corps Wehrmacht. That's because as of this moment, Panzer Corps and Slytherin's entire Steam catalog is on sale, so I figured why not take a look at the game that is one of the originals of my sort of YouTube career, if you want to call it that. And also, you know, one of the most successful videos that I've done was my Panzer Corps review from all the way back in 2012 when the channel was still very young. With that being said, again, this was taken from a live stream, but I did want to kind of start chopping it up and sharing it with the rest of you. We've seen the first couple of episodes of the Battle of Poland, where I talked about the fact that, yeah, all these games are on sale, and the fact that Panzer Corps 2 was announced. That's the other impetus to my return to Panzer Corps, is the fact that Slytherin has announced a sequel to the Panzer Corps series, and that will be coming out next year, so that will be interesting to see. With that being said, we are in the process of fighting the Battle of Norway, and again, this was taken from a live stream. I've actually already done a video on the Battle of Norway way back when, and I think I talked a little bit more about the history back then. So in this video, I'm just going to jump back into the live stream audio. In the next video, I think what I'm going to do in the Battle of France is I'm actually going to talk not only about the game, but more so a review of Max Hastings' book, Inferno, which is sort of a survey-level history of the Second World War. And I've found it very interesting. He's a very good writer, very engaging. It's very much pop history, so if you're really into academic history and kind of nitty-gritty details and understanding really the rationale behind why things happened, it's not necessarily the best history for you then. But if you're more just kind of getting a flavor for, okay, what happened, and in this book specifically, what were people saying about it? He relies heavily on first-person accounts of individuals. He doesn't make a ton of penetrating academic analysis of why things occurred, more along the lines of just explaining as they occurred, how they occurred, and kind of what people thought about what was occurring at the time. But it was a very interesting read. Oh, hell. Well, I'm in the middle of it. Why not just jump into the review here in this video? So forget what I was saying. This is not good filmography. You shouldn't lead your audience on for 2 minutes saying what you're going to do and then go ahead and completely change it. But that's what I'm going to do here. So we're going to talk about Max Hastings' book, Inferno, which I've already said is kind of a survey-level history of World War II. It's kind of interesting because he doesn't detail too much about why the war broke out. It really feels like it just kind of throws you into, Nazi Germany's invading Poland. It does provide some survey level about the Nazis, but it kind of feels like the book glosses over the Pacific theater. It focuses heavily on the Russian front, which is appropriate. Well, why don't I back up a bit? So the book goes chronologically from 1939 to 1941, looking exclusively at the Western theater. From Hastings' perspective, the war in China is not part of World War II. It's a separate conflict, which is probably accurate. But he doesn't really look at Japanese actions in China, other than just sort of a broad overview when he starts talking about the rationale for the U.S. beginning to care about World War II. He details the many challenges faced politically in the Western countries, and this book, I think, does a good job of kind of explaining how the Western democracies were kind of half-heartedly involved in World War II, or that was the perception by many. I think it's interesting when he's talking about, the British and the French have this promise to the Poles that when Poland gets invaded, they're going to come to their aid. But then when Poland does get invaded, they kind of do everything they can to not help. And then, when the Poles are asking, is this counteroffensive ever going to happen? They're basically like, whatever, stop bothering us. And then when the Poles are defeated, they remove them from the Allied War Council and just kind of act like whatever, they never existed. And that kind of, it's a trend that you see throughout the book, whether it's getting, supporting a Yugoslavian coup, which then leads Yugoslavia into war with the Germans, if it's supporting the Greeks in their war against the Italians, and then eventually the Germans, if it's the way that they treat any of their colonial subjects. The Western Allies do not come off all that well in this book, which is kind of interesting. The French come off monstrously in this book, which is, again, interesting. I know that, I knew going into reading this book that the French resistance was kind of overblown. Their impact on the war was not as much as maybe pop history would have us believe. But really, it's kind of non-existent until late 43, early 44, when the Germans implement some forced labor policies on the French that the French can't stand. The French do quite a bit to collaborate with the Germans for quite a long time. The French, I did not know, ended up fighting the British in Syria in some pretty bloody battles. They resisted pretty heavily initially in the Torch landings. There were naval engagements between the British and the French. At one time or another, it was more plausible that the French may have gotten dragged into, the war on the side of the Germans after the fall of France than it would have been for them to come in on the side of the Western Allies. So the French don't come off well. It starts talking about how when the Free French forces start invading Italy, there's these, and most of them are colonial forces that he kind of accuses of doing this. But there's these massive, issues of rape where French colonial units were going around and raping entire Italian towns and villages and basically pillaging these places the way that we think about what the Soviets did when the Soviets took Berlin in 1945. So again, the French, whether they're Free French, whether they're Vichy French, there are certainly notable examples that he calls out, saying that, hey, these individuals did some noble work and, were good people. He calls out, I forget what her name was, but there was a French kind of aristocrat, very, very wealthy, who spent her entire fortune shielding and harboring Jewish artists and Jewish individuals at this estate of hers. Eventually, some were captured and some were sent to the gas chambers. When France kind of started being forced to crack down. But essentially, she sacrificed her life savings. She died broke in 1970 because this huge sum of money, this huge fortune that she had, she used all of it to protect these Jews. But these were the outliers. These were the individuals that stood out in society as willing to take a serious risk and sacrifice, in many cases, their lives. They were not the majority of the population. The majority of the population did not come off well in this book at all. The majority of the population came off as self-centered. And I'm not speaking of France anymore. I'm speaking of Western democracies in general, and somewhat uncommitted to this conflict for quite a while. The British, on the other hand, we talked about the French, and this isn't meant to accuse the French of anything. I just think it's a story that we don't usually hear told when we think about World War II. You hear about World War II, and you don't hear the story of, the French were, very perhaps uncommitted to the war when the war broke out. We're involved in using other countries as proxies, almost like a colonial conflict, and then we're trying to figure out ways to mitigate, bloodshed and even being asked to fight. And, then once France falls, you have... and by the way, the dysfunction that existed between the British and the French in World War II, I knew there was a lot of issues in the relationship there, but holy crap, those armies didn't work well together in the Low Countries in France. From the British perspective, the hubris of Britain and the rashness of, I think, Churchill really came through. I think, and I guess what I'm doing is less so talking about a review specifically and talking very high level, kind of some of the stories and themes that come through in this book. I'm not going to say everything that it talks about. Spoiler alert, the Germans lose. But I am going to talk about just kind of my perceptions and some of the key takeaways that I had that I learned that I didn't know going in. And then, how I feel about the book in general. Which, again, spoiler alert, is pretty positive, but it's just an interesting look at a conflict that we know a lot about, but this book does try and talk about topics that we don't typically hear a lot about in mainstream pop history. It is no doubt pop history, and what I mean by pop history is not a deep intellectual look at the war. But what it does is it looks at some lesser known topics. It spends quite a long time, for example, talking about the Italians in World War II. Not so much their naval exploits in the Mediterranean. It really doesn't delve much into the battles that were being fought between the British and the Italians in the Mediterranean. It kind of glosses over the naval war altogether. It doesn't detail too much about the U-boat war, other than the fact that the Germans, even in the peak of their successes, were not sinking enough shipping to really be a long-term threat. The trend lines were concerning from the British, but they were never actually in any trouble. But it details in much more detail the topics you don't hear as much about. So there's a couple of key diaries and key individuals he talks over and over and over about with the Italians in North Africa, and just how disconnected the North African campaign was from the way that the rest of the war was fought. It talks about sort of the lackluster commitment to the conflict on the Italian part. But then when the Italians, surrendered and switched sides, and the Western Allies were in Italy, their almost revulsion at the way that they were treated, whether it was the French colonial forces going around raping every woman in villages, and driving, people to insanity because they were raping them over and over and over again, or whether it was just the sheer destruction brought on Italy from, the Allied bombing campaign and the Allied effort as they slogged across Italy. You hear these stories that you don't typically hear. And the home front doesn't always come off as the most connected or rationale group either. Some of the accounts of the women in Germany, that he uses some diaries from some women that are writing about these German soldiers as they're coming through Berlin, defeated toward the very end of the war. And it's almost like these citizens are looking on their own soldiers with disgust, because they're not the epitome of manlyhood, like they've failed to live up to the Aryan requirements, which I guess makes some sense. Like, I'm not sure, it doesn't really come off strictly as anti-Nazi so much as it just does like disgust and disappointment in their own people, which, I mean, there's plenty to be disgusted and disappointed about in Nazi Germany, but it didn't come off as a criticism of Nazi Germany. It just came off as a criticism of these soldiers who were in the midst of fighting the Russian advance. I don't know. My thoughts are kind of discombobulated on this whole subject, but where I was going with the British earlier is that essentially this book also talks about how, we think of Churchill as being this, visionary politician who knew this, the German menace ahead of time, and, had some rather outlandish ideas like invading Greece as a southern front, or shifting the front mainly to Italy. And what I found really interesting, I mentioned this earlier, but almost the Western Allies' unwillingness to fight. And that wasn't limited. I think we think of it being the French being terrified of World War I, so they didn't want to launch, invasions of Germany because they wanted to try and avoid that. But that's a common trend for both the French and the British. And we don't think of Churchill as being that way, but Churchill did not want, according to this, the British specifically, and Churchill as well, did not want a mainland invasion through France, through the heartland of Europe. After the fall of France, they wanted to hit Hitler on the peripheries. They wanted to attack Norway. They wanted to attack Greece. They wanted to attack Italy. They wanted to essentially do everything they could to avoid fighting a slogfest campaign in France in the way of World War I, which is interesting, right? I mean, that's not at all what the American perspective was. The American perspective was, we need to land in France, we need to liberate France, and we need to advance on Germany directly. And the British campaign, North Africa is a good example of it, where the British wanted to fight the Germans on the peripheries, kind of poke at them till they die, and kind of seemingly let the Soviets do all the dying, and just kind of come in and pick up the spoils. Until the very end, when Churchill wanted to do everything he could to head off the Soviets. But the book does a good job of pointing out it wasn't the Western Allies that won the war. It was the Soviet, infantryman and his willingness to lose and continue on fighting with massive casualties. And we kind of know that, but I think the book did a really good job of demonstrating that. And demonstrating the way that the Western Allies used other countries as their pawns and their surrogates throughout the conflict. Less so America, because it wasn't involved till much later in the war. But the British wanted to, the British used Greece. The British used Yugoslavia. The British used Norway. They pulled their troops out of Norway, or they were ordered to pull their troops out of Norway when they were withdrawing from Norway without telling the Norwegian soldiers. I mean, there was no partnership between France and Britain and the other countries that were on their side. Whether it was Poland, whether it was Yugoslavia, whether it was Greece, whether it was Norway, there was this constant disrespect for their partners that they were fighting with. And at the end of the day, the book really doesn't paint the leadership of Britain in the best light. It kind of makes the comment that not a single British commander really stood out as an effective commander. Monty was overly cautious, constantly failing to, follow through on great opportunities. But it wasn't just Monty. This was a common problem for the Western Allies in general. Patton, Ike, Omar Bradley, they failed to adequately seal off the Falaise pocket. It was just this blundering war effort throughout on the Western side. And this sort of this book almost has an admiration for the German soldiers' ability to fight effectively, and the Western soldiers' inability to fight all that effectively. These are kind of the themes that are. This isn't a formal review because I didn't take notes and look to be critical per se, but these are the themes that came through in this book constantly. As I read it, there were these things that I kept coming back to, these messages that kept coming up, these issues that were always resurfacing, and it was almost always this constant harp on, wow, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking the Western Allies did not stand out as being terribly effective. The author does put a good point in that a lot of this is you can only acknowledge that some of these things are within the context of their time. So, for example, he makes the argument that the invasion of the Philippines was completely unnecessary and never should have happened from the American perspective. And, he's probably right, but he also acknowledges that politically there was no way that the Americans were just going to stop at the Marianas Islands in the Central Pacific and, not attack Iwo Jima, not attack Okinawa, not, move forward. Even though these islands had little strategic value, it wasn't something that, was politically feasible. At the moment, you got this army and you say, well, we can just sit back and let them starve and bomb them to bits, or we can, keep fighting. And I think the answer he's making is, well, yes, technically speaking, there are arguments that can be made that these things were unnecessary. You can't take it out of the context of the time. And I'm really rambling here. I think it's a book that I would recommend people check out. It's an interesting, well-written book that I think will challenge some of your assumptions about the war. One thing that it brings up that I had no clue was apparently Churchill, when he was Secretary of the Navy, or First Sea Lord or whatever that was, he was proposing that when the Soviets invaded Poland, that the British declare war on the Soviets as well. A little bit crazy, right? So it's interesting that Churchill constantly used surrogates as soldiers fighting on the ground, taking the majority of the casualties for the British, whereas, Chamberlain was less willing to expand the war while he was in office. Although certainly you saw some expansion with Norway and Poland. Well, Norway he didn't have anything to do with, but Poland, Poland he didn't have anything to do with, but Norway. Oh my God. I think I'm still going to keep this video put together, but my thoughts are a mess. I'll probably end it here, but I guess my point is this is an interesting book to look at. And I think it makes you think about things in a way that maybe you otherwise wouldn't have. And I don't know how much I agree with all of it. I don't think I did a very good job of explaining it, but it's a very well-written and enjoyable book to read. So if that is, intriguing enough to get you to kind of think about this again and maybe check the book out, then do that. If you're as confused as I sound in this, then maybe it's not the right book to pick up. I'll leave it at that, because I'm recording this at 3 a.m. and I probably shouldn't post it in this format. But wow. Long story short is I've really enjoyed Inferno. It really kind of ignores the Pacific theater to the most extent that it can. It doesn't talk about Japan's invasion of China really until very late. You're halfway into the invasion of Russia before it brings up the United States. It mentions Pearl Harbor. It mentions kind of the U.S.'s slow slide to war and FDR's attempt to drag his country, toward conflict, but his country's unwillingness to consider conflict. It talks about sort of these conspiratorial groups that were already thinking that FDR was up to no good and that he was trying to get the U.S. involved in war, and it kind of explains to me where some of that Pearl Harbor conspiracyism comes from, because it existed in the U.S. prior to Pearl Harbor itself. And so, when you've got these groups of people that already think there are conspiracy theories, when something big like Pearl Harbor happens, it's easy to see how they would extend that to Pearl Harbor. It does talk about Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, but it does so in a much more superficial, over-the-top look. I thought the most interesting pieces were when he talked about the Russian campaigns, the diary entries from the soldiers there. The Russians, he calls their army a barbarian mob, which they were in World War II. I don't know how many of you know this. I knew it going in, but, when the Soviets conquered Western Europe but when the Soviets retook the land from the Germans, once they got out of the Soviet Union, once they moved into Poland and other, in many cases victims of Nazi aggression, they basically looted indiscriminately, raped indiscriminately, millions, and there was systematic rape that occurred in Germany, but not just Germany, in Poland as well. They raped and shot Jews who survived Nazi Germany, there's a story of a lawyer who had protected his wife for somehow he had kept his Jewish wife alive in Germany for the entire war, and then when Berlin falls, 3 Russian soldiers rape his wife in front of him after shooting him while he's bleeding to death. It does a good job of painting the absolute horror that was World War II from a mostly European perspective. And it's very well written. I think it paints a picture of the Western Allies as being largely incompetent. That's my interpretation of it. That may not be entirely fair, but I think he's very critical of the Western Allies. He's very critical their their approach to war making. He points out that they really were more in it. They were in it to win it, but they weren't really the one. They were content to sit back and let the Soviets take the brunt of the casualties. And yet they didn't want that to be, the way that the post-war world shouldn't reflect the Soviets being the bulk of the fighting. One thing I didn't know that it also talked about was kind of the logistical side of things. So apparently half of all Soviet boots were made in the United States. Something like a third or more of all Soviet vehicles were made in the United States. There's this, I guess, apparently there's a mantra that I didn't know about, that the World War II was won by Soviet soldiers, but on the backs of American trucks and American logistics. America provided, for every single soldier in the Red Army, America provided the Russians a half a pound of meat a day through supplies and convoys and what have you. So again, that's just really interesting when you think about it. You think, from everything you're talking about in this book, everything I've been talking about, the Soviets won the war, given, they did the vast majority of the fighting. True. But on the flip side of that, they likely would have starved to death or been unable to launch the counterattacks that they did, or certainly the war would have gone much longer without the logistical support of the United States. So it was really won in American factories with the lives of Soviet soldiers. I think it would be interesting to see what would have happened without American logistical support in the long term, because, again, Russia had the issue in World War I where they simply could not keep their troops fed and supplied. And I think you could easily see the same exact thing happening to the Soviets if they didn't have these massive, trucks of supplies coming in from the United States, these massive shipments coming through these northern convoys. But really, to me, it's a look at the war that I think you don't often see. It talks, again, a lot about diary entries, a lot of first-person sources, a lot of things that are challenging to the typical narration around World War II. It definitely doesn't shy away from the fact that, American soldiers did, it accuses American soldiers of, killing prisoners at times too, British as well. But it also is pretty clear that the extent that they did it, as opposed to the French, when you were getting revenge on Germany and invading Germany, or much more so to the Soviets, to not just Germans but to Poles alike, it's really interesting. And really, at the end of the day, what I think it comes down to is the Western Allies using proxy forces, be they Yugoslavian partisans, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Yugoslavians, the Greeks, or their colonials as proxies for their own forces in World War II. That may be controversial to say, but that's what the book says anyway. So I don't know enough to know whether this is incredibly accurate or not. All I know is that Hastings is a very well-regarded author. He writes incredibly compelling history from a story perspective, and if that's something you're interested in reading a little bit more about, pick it up. Also, let me know your thoughts below. I know I've kind of clarified my thoughts here later in the video, so I'll probably post it up as is. But as you can tell, I'm still kind of processing what I think about it. I'm still kind of trying to decide what I think about it. And I'd be interested to see if any of you have read the book. Let me know what your thoughts are about it below. Again, this isn't a review per se. It's more of just me talking about something I've been reading lately and finding really interesting lately. But I want to hear your thoughts as well. So I know you guys never hesitate to leave comments in the discussion forum below. I certainly encourage you to do so as well. With that being said, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this video up. We are about halfway through the invasion of Norway. We're in the process of reducing Oslo right now. We've taken the major western objectives as well as, is it Trondheim, the one objective in the north? So we have one more objective to advance on in the north. We've got to finish reducing Oslo. And then I think we're pretty much about done. I think this fight is looking good if we're going to try and get a decisive victory before France. We'll see. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember exactly how this battle unfolded. You can see there we just took Oslo as well. So we're most of the way through the Norwegian campaign. One other thing is the book also kind of inspired me to think about maybe doing like a documentary style video about video games and history. I think we often have this interpretation of history being one way, and our games often reflect that. But wondering if that's always how accurately games reflect history. So what I mean by that is, he makes a big point on how a lot of countries collaborated with the Nazis. Tons of collaborators in Ukraine and the Baltic states. They all work, a lot of people working with the Nazis after they took over their countries, but not just those countries. France as well had a huge collaborator population in France. And it wasn't really until the tide of the war turned that mentality worked against them. So I think there's an interesting perspective in war games where you don't usually see that side of things. You're playing Strategic Command, for example. You conquer France. You don't get to start raising French garrison units or French divisions, but there was an SS division made up of largely Frenchmen, for example. The eastern countries that the Germans conquered, Croatia, I believe you can raise some forces from in Strategic Command. Strategic Command also models the partisan conflicts in Yugoslavia, so it kind of has a forward-looking view of partisan activity in World War II in Europe, but it still doesn't allow you to really benefit from the 300,000 plus individuals who took up picks and shovels, not so much arms, but they directly worked with the Nazis on rounding up Jews, on doing these other things, and certainly they would have raised arms with them if they could. So again, I think it's an interesting perspective of games don't really cover that, and I think there's a very good reason games don't cover creating gas chambers and gassing millions of Jews. That would be horrible for a game to cover, but there are other pieces of World War II that we don't really remember. Again, we think of the French resistance as being far more than it was. Now, games don't really cover that outside of a couple of FPSs, and that's fine, but we also missed the opportunity to talk about the collaboration that occurred between various sides and the bad guys, if you will, in retrospect. And I just wonder if what I'm talking about is maybe doing like a video docudrama on that, but about games and how games reflect history and our perceptions of history, and are what games tell us about the conflicts really all that accurate. And I know to some people it's just, hey, I want to play a game that lets me move chits around the map, and I want to play a game that lets me kind of recreate these things I read in the history book. I think that's what history is, games and history are for the vast majority of people. But with that being said, I think there is something there where there are elements that might make good gameplay elements that we leave out because they're not to the mind of what we want, what we think of when we think of World War II. But that doesn't mean that the game is necessarily being accurate. So I think I've seen some really good film reviewers on YouTube that do some really interesting stuff, and I think if there's the right mix of what games cover versus reality, and if there's the right mix of footage and talking points there, it could be an interesting idea to cover. But it's just kind of a heads up that I may end up trying to do that. With that all being said, that's kind of my thoughts on Inferno. Again, kind of convoluted thoughts, right? Not terribly clear, but share yours below. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and wrap the video up, and we'll come back and finish the Battle of Norway in a follow-on video. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for listening and watching, and until next time, I'm out.